What's up everybody, I'm Jason, and today I'm going to walk through setting up dual rear button focusing on Canon's EOS R5 camera. That said, this same technique, as far as I know, can be done on the EOS R6 and the original EOS R as well. Moreover, if you're a mid or high-end Canon DSLR user, this is also available to you. However, I've covered that setup in a previous video, which I'll link in the description below. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of rear button focusing. Sometimes this is called dual button focusing. This is the technique where the autofocus operation is triggered by a button on the back of the camera instead of by half pressing the shutter release. One of the unique features of Canon's cameras is the ability to configure multiple buttons for autofocus activation, where each of those buttons can be tailored to specific autofocus optimizations. So for example, the AF on button could be configured to use a single autofocus point and one-shot mode, while the auto exposure lock button could be configured to use the auto area mode and servo tracking. This allows the photographer to rapidly and easily adapt to changing situations with just the push of a different button, instead of having to reconfigure the camera on the fly or potentially shoot with less than optimal settings in the first place. I first started using this technique when I was doing a lot of bird photography. I configured my AF on button for single point pattern and one shot AF, and then which gave me the most control over placing and getting optimal focus for a static subject like a perching bird. However, that's clearly not the right configuration for birds in flight. So for that, I had my AE lock button configured to full area selection and AI Servo AF. So with this configuration, I can happily be shooting a static bird perched on a branch and then transition immediately to flight shots when the bird took off, with only having to move my thumb from one button to the next. With the introduction of the EOS R series, Canon has made some changes to the capabilities of the AF system. Specifically, they've removed the ability to register an autofocus point. This affects the dual rear button focusing technique, at least as I described it in my previous video. This is because I used registered autofocus points as a quick way to allow you to modify and reconfigure the second button's focusing pattern. Now, admittedly, in practice, at least for me, the change doesn't have that much of a practical impact. I never really changed my second button's autofocus pattern, so even though I was doing it that way, I just didn't really use it that way. Aside from moving the registered autofocus point, there aren't that many other changes to the dual AF button configuration. However, let's just jump in and look at it. So, out of the box, the EOS R5 comes configured so that the AF on and shutter half press activate the autofocus system. If you're just switching to single rear button focusing, half the work has already been done for you and you just need to disable the AF activation on the shutter release. It also means that out of the box, the process for going to dual rear button focusing is basically already started too. So let's get started with getting the camera set up for just single rear button focusing. To do this, we start by jumping into the menu by pressing the menu button and switching over to the Custom Function 3 menu. In the Custom Function 3 menu, we want to select the Customize Buttons option. And in this menu, there's two columns. In the Still Photography column, which is the left column of buttons, we want to select the shutter button. And we want to change the shutter button settings from metering and autofocus start to just metering start. Press set on that and save the setting. Now, the camera here is now set up just for single rear button focusing. And if that's all you wanted to do, then you can stop here, get out of the menus, and go out and shoot. If you want to do dual rear button focusing, then we need to set up the second button and configure this. For this, we'll be reconfiguring the auto exposure lock or star button for our second autofocus button. So in the same Customize Buttons menu that we were just in, or still in, we want to select the auto exposure lock button again on the left column or the still photography column. we want to change the settings from the default of auto exposure lock, flash exposure lock to metering and autofocus start. Then, unlike before where we just pressed set and got out of it, we want to press info or tap the on-screen button for detailed settings. Here's where we customize the settings for this button so it doesn't do the same thing as the first button. So this is where the EOS R series differs from the EOS DSLRs. If you watched my previous video on doing this with an EOS DSLR, you'll notice that the menu here doesn't look the same. On the 5D Mark IV, for example, you had 4 options in this menu. Those were AF start position, AI Servo AF characteristics, AF operation, and AF area selection mode. On the R5, you only have 3. These are AF operation, AF method, and Servo AF characteristics. So starting with the AF operation setting, this is where you customize this button to always run in one-shot servo or one-shot mode, servo mode, or to match what your camera normally is set to. So if your camera's set to one shot, it'll match that. The way I have mine set up is to have the second AF button always doing Servo AF so that I have it as a fallback to immediately track a moving subject regardless of how I'm set up my AF system. Next up is the AF method. This lets you change essentially the AF area or pattern that this button uses. You can have it match the standard setup on the camera, so what your other button's doing, or you can override that with specifying, say, full area tracking, spot, single point, any of the other autofocus area modes. Now, as far as picking your patterns go, I don't find that there's a lot of utility in going from a large area pattern as the standard on the camera to a spot pattern or a smaller area as the override. What I've found is that if you're switching between, say, single and expanded points, so maybe your main mode is at spot and your second mode is the full area, or the not 8-point surround area AF mode, then the second button, focus option, will always follow that first point. However, if you're switching between a large area mode, like the full area tracking mode, to a single point, there's no way to control the position of that single point when you're using that focus mode. Now, again, my use case is to have this button as a quick way to transition to tracking something. So I have mine set to the face plus tracking mode, which uses the whole sensor area and detects people and animal faces for focusing. The final option is the Servo AF characteristics setting. So this lets you fine-tune the servo characteristics tracking for this button. And again, it can match the camera's normal setting or whatever you're set to in your standard mode, or you can override it to any of the 4+ auto specialized cases. So on my camera, I have it set to auto. But you could just as easily use something more specific depending on how you actually end up using the camera in the field. So for example, if you were a sports photographer, you might have both rear buttons doing the same thing with respect to the servo mode and patterns, but you might have one set to ignore obstacles and one set to deal with quickly accelerating subjects. So that's it, dual rear button focusing. If you're a rear button focusing user and you're working in rapidly evolving situations, you might want to just give this a try and you might find that it's a handy feature. If you found this tip useful, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing. And as always, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.